Hi everyone, and welcome to our Evolving ESG Landscape webinar. I'm Marianne Cummings, the Director of Strategic Development here at Austmine, and I'm pleased to be your host today. I'm joined today by a group of ESG and sustainability experts who will share their views on how ESG has evolved and what it means for METS companies. We're privileged to have Angie Beifus, Global Lead, Mining and Minerals and Metals Analyst with EY, Jenny Agnew, Business Sustainability Manager with Sedgman, and Robert Blyth, the Contracts and Procurement Manager at Harmony Eva Copper Mine. Following the three presentations, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. So please put those questions in as we go in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the lands on which we all meet today. For me here in Newcastle, New South Wales, I acknowledge the Awabakal and the Worimi people. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any First Nations people joining us today. I guess we can summarise ESG by asking three questions. In the E, what is the impact of business operations on the environment? The S, what is the impact of business operations on society? And with governance, how are the internal controls for decision-making and business operations structured? How is ethical, sustainable and transparent behaviour governed, measured and reported on? These ESG considerations are no longer confined to a niche audience, and they're central to strategic decision-making, stakeholder relationships and long-term sustainability of your business. And while the E, the S and the G haven't changed, the emphasis of issues within each of these does change. Each of these pillars does change and evolve. And to get us started exploring some of these changes, I'd like to welcome Angie Beifus, Global Mining and Metals Lead Analyst at EY. Thanks, Angie.
Thanks, Marianne. Nice to be here today. So as Marianne said, I'm the Global Mining and Metals Lead Analyst, and I'm the co-author of our Mining and Metals report, which is the business risk and opportunity in mining sector. And I also focus on kind of strategic issues relating to security of supply of minerals and metals for the energy transition, which obviously has a huge element of ESG in it as well. So this is the 16th year of our Business Risks and Opportunities report, and the third year where ESG has topped the ranking in terms of importance. The top 10 that you see here is probably not something that would necessarily apply to every single geography and every single commodity market, but we do find that having this view sort of at a global level gives us an idea of a way of discussing, I guess, the issues and challenges and opportunities that come from these different areas. It's also worth mentioning that ESG, license to operate, climate change could arguably all just be bucketed under ESG. And I tend to agree with that, but I think because they're such large topics, we've split them out so that we can really discuss them in more detail. We did find this year that, you know, the risks are really being impacted by a large number of societal and capital influences, and the external environment is having a way bigger influence on the risks this year than previously. And I think we've also seen a huge amount of geopolitical risk, which is also coming into play in the ESG area. So the risks are very complex, they're very interlinked, and you'll find that there's probably an ESG aspect in most of them. And one of those areas, I guess you could see, is that capital has moved up from risk number 8 last year to number 2 this year. And partially that's because the sector is competing for investment and incentives relating to developing new projects to supply the energy transition. But there's also an element where access to capital is really going to be influenced, if you like, by the level of ESG compliance. We're also seeing a shift from short-term focus on returns to that longer-term focus on value. And some of that is that recognition that we are starting to put in longer-term targets. So perhaps, you know, nature positive by 2030 or net zero by 2050. So every year we do ask the question, which are the top risks or the top ESG issues that are facing scrutiny from investors? And I think while the executives that we spoke to said that they have a better understanding of sustainability issues, they feel that they can't tackle all areas at once. So it's really an issue of prioritization as well. And miners need to be careful sort of where they're investing time and capital, but then at the same time also be careful not to just be focusing on one area of ESG. So for example, not just thinking perhaps on decarbonization, but thinking of some of the other issues as well. And scenario planning in this case could be something that could help miners to think about where the trade-offs might be. Last year, we also said that net zero won't really be enough, that you really need to be net positive on ESG. And I think we've seen a lot of progress in that area, particularly with regards to water and nature or biodiversity. The ICMM made a commitment on nature, and many miners have called it out as a priority. For example, Teck is working towards a goal of a nature positive future by 2030. And as I think you'll hear later in this webinar, it's really regulation that drives some of that change. And the ISSB has announced that they're going to develop the next stage of reporting standards for risks and opportunities relating to biodiversity and ecosystems, as well as human capital. And these new reporting standards will build on the ones that were released by the ISSB in 2023. And the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures also announced last month that they'll be working with the ISSB. A couple of other things just to call out here in terms of changes. Tailings last year was at less than 5% in terms of issues facing scrutiny. And you'll see now that it is kind of second from the top at 55%. Part of that is probably driven by the global industry standard for tailings management. But I think it's probably broader than that. And we are seeing, I guess, the will to do something different in this area. And there's a lot of really good innovation and collaboration in this space. UBC, the University of British Columbia, for example, is running a program around extracting minerals from waste. And we're also seeing a lot of activity around dry tailings as well. It's also important to focus, and I will get to this under license to operate as well, but focus on not just your existing operations, but what the legacy will be after you close the mine. And so mine closure is also in at 22%, which is probably a little low given the importance of the topic. And I think we're expecting to see that might move higher this year. But as we haven't run the survey yet, can't tell whether that's true, but that's sort of the expectation that we sort of feel. And then circular economy has also moved up quite substantially. And I think that's that focus on supply constraints, particularly with the energy transition accelerating, and starting to see a focus on going beyond recycling and really implementing that circular circular economy around waste. And using metals for longer. And of course, there are a lot of benefits to those who do get this right in terms of that improved access to capital, a better talent pipeline, and stronger license to operate. And so thinking about what's changed in terms of license to operate, I think the fact that so much of the land on which mines need to be developed is Indigenous land means that building trust is really key. And our sector, unfortunately, doesn't have the best track record when it comes to trust. And the fact that societal expectations are expanding means that we need to have more transparency to be able to communicate better with communities, and really think about how to leave a really long-term legacy after mines close as well. And part of that, I guess, working closer with communities also helps in terms of managing the really complex licensing. and needing to go beyond just regulation to really gain license to operate with communities and also broader society. We've also seen some of the regulators increase their expectations around community engagement and development. For example, the ICMM, the OECD, and also things like the Copper Mark have imposed or increased expectations. And I think transparency is also really important as we kind of go into the thinking about supplying the energy transition. So we need to have products that are considered green to get that, not just the societal return, but also, I guess, a market return as we start to see things like green premiums become more available, not as available as they will be, but they will become more available. And then climate change. The World Economic Forum notes that climatic events and climate change are the kind of the top risk that we're really going to face globally over the next 10 to 15 years. And I think this is a very complex issue for miners as they have to decarbonize, but at the same time provide minerals and metals for the energy transition. And then also have to manage the impacts of climatic events, often in rather remote regions. So, for example, the wildfires in Canada had a really big effect on mining and metals companies, where mines had to be stopped and staff evacuated. And I think some of the executives we spoke to suggested that it's perhaps something that needs to be planned for, and perhaps even these kind of stoppage days worked into operations, just to have that, I guess, leeway to plan for these events. Some of the companies that we interviewed this year were also really candid about the challenges they were having in meeting their interim net zero targets. But what was interesting is we didn't see a sort of a back down on ambition, but rather how do companies change their strategies to be able to meet those targets. And some of the areas that we've seen a focus on include vehicle electrification, which is expensive. But then, there are other ways to think about diesel transition. So perhaps batteries, biofuels, hydrogen. Renewables is also increasingly something that's being considered, but obviously very land and time intensive, and also need backup energy sources in the form of storage to be able to factor in for intermittency. I guess finally, the other area that we have seen a focus on is in terms of scope 3 emissions. While we're not really seeing targets set, I think companies are exploring their options to be able to improve performance. So looking at sustainable supply chain, circular economy, and then also how do they collaborate to do that. So I hope that's given you a very brief overview and a sort of setting the scene in terms of, what's changed from last year looking at these 3 areas. Thanks, Marianne.
Thanks, Angie. That was great. It's really helpful for us to see, what miners are reporting as being changing, because obviously that has a flow-on effect for METS companies. Please pop any questions you've got for Angie in the Q&A box, and we'll answer them at the end. Okay, in the last 12 months, we've seen changes to ESG reporting, as Angie foreshadowed, including introduction of a new climate financial reporting bill. Jenny Agnew, Business Sustainability Manager with Sedgman, will take us through some of these changes. Thanks, Jenny.
Hi, everybody. Good to have you here today. I'm just going to give you a bit of a brief overview of the current reporting landscape in Australia. Look, a lot of these won't hit all Austmine members the same. It's really dependent on the size of your company, the number of employees you have, and the emissions that are created at your facilities. So currently, formal reporting covers the anger and safeguard mechanism. This is to do with your scope 1 and 2 emissions on your sites, and this hits currently around 400 entities. But if it doesn't hit you, it might hit your clients, and they may be asking you to support their reporting. There's also the National Pollutant Inventory for facilities that exceed thresholds for over 90 priority substances. And also for ASX listed companies, there's requirements from ASIC on material exposures to climate, environmental and social risks. There's not a current set framework, we'll talk about that coming, but most companies a lot use the Global Reporting Initiative standards or the Sustainability Accounting Standards Boards or other frameworks. In Australia, we also have the Modern Slavery Act, which currently impacts entities who have above $100 million revenue. That's had a review recently. The government's looking at putting in some additional requirements potentially and supports, but that's all pending still. And lastly, this is the thing that's coming in now, is the climate-related financial disclosures. So as Marianne mentioned, there is a draft bill before Parliament, and this is coming in to put in some frameworks for how companies disclose alongside their financial reporting, their climate-related exposures. And we'll go in to talk about this a little bit more now. Oops. So this is a little bit of a timeline for the Australian mandatory climate disclosure requirements. So in 2022, the government put in legislation around national emissions reductions and net zero targets. And following that, there was releases of consultation papers around mandatory climate reporting framework and the reporting requirements. And at the end of 23, we saw the release of the Australian Sustainability Standards Exposure Draft. And following that, the draft legislation in January this year, which is currently before Parliament. So subject to parliamentary processes, that means for the Group 1 companies, which I'll go into, which companies are required to disclose depending on the size and emissions and revenue. For Group 1 companies from the end, for companies that have reporting periods starting on or after the 1st of January next year, that's when that will start to kick in. And following that, Group 2 and 3 companies will be reporting, and we'll go into that next. So this is an overview of which companies will need to report based on the number of employees you have, your assets and your revenue. If you hit 2 of these thresholds, then that tells you which group you're likely to be in and the starting date for when your annual reporting period starts. So for Group 1, that will start for the reporting period likely from January next year. For Group 2, the following year, and Group 3 the year after that. So what is actually required? So the draft Australian Accounting Standards Board standard, number SRS1, the general requirements for disclosure of this information includes governance. So this is talking about your governance structures, the skills and competencies there, the oversight, so what targets, risk and opportunities there is, and the delegation of responsibilities. In terms of strategy, this is about disclosing how you're managing climate-related risks and opportunities and the impacts of those on your business model, cash flows and capital, supply chain, resilience of your strategy, and your progress on the plans that you have made. In terms of risk management, we're looking at reporting on processes to identify, assess, prioritize, and monitor risks and opportunities related to climate-related risks, and integration of those into how the company manages risk in general. In terms of metrics and targets, we're looking at reporting the performance in relation to climate-related risks and opportunities, including progress towards any targets your company has set or is required to meet. The second standard is a little bit more detailed in terms of reporting. It refers back to the first one in terms of governance and risk assessment, but there's a lot more detail required in terms of resourcing for meeting your climate-related targets that you've set, detail on your transition plans, what technology you have in your plan to adopt to meet those targets, and adaptation mitigations efforts, including any use of offsets. And you're also required to go through at least 2 cases of climate-related scenarios and outline your assumptions. For metrics and targets, businesses are going to be required to report on scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. There is detailed guidance on the methodologies that need to be used for this, and that leans heavily on the ENGA scheme legislation. So for those that are currently reporting under that scheme, it won't be super different to that. What is new is that we're going to see scope 3 reporting requirements phased in. There are transitional provisions though. Companies are going to be able to use data from previous reporting periods if they're not available at the time of reporting. And it's phased in, so it's going to be required in your second period of reporting. We're also going to be reporting on transition and physical risks and opportunities, what capital is being deployed, if you are using an internal carbon price, as well as any executive remuneration tied to this performance. Now that we're being required to report sustainability information alongside our financial disclosures, that also means that we're going to have assurance requirements being phased in. This is a bit of a shift in expectations for Australian companies, but you'll see from this table here that these are phased in over time. So you will have time to start building up the capability of your team and any external support for audits that you will need. So looking forward, there's more changes on the horizon as well. Greenwashing crackdowns are something to look out for. In 2023, ASIC issued detailed guidance on this regarding disclosure for ESG and put in some additional funding for enforcement. There's also a national framework for circular economy looking to be released at the end of this year, and that's on track to potentially become a compliance requirement in Australia. In addition, the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act is under review as part of the government's Nature Positive plan. So more details to come there and likely to be split into a multitude of consultation plans to come out. Another interesting one that may affect members in Australia is carbon border adjustment. This is currently under review to see what that could look like for Australia and whether it will be adopted. Initially, we'll focus on steel and cement, and this is to do with adjusting for imports of the scope 3 emissions, basically the embedded carbon in products that are being imported into Australia. In addition, there's a review of ENGA legislation has been conducted, and there's recommendations for changes to the scheme, in particular estimation methods, which will include fugitive methane. So that's for those companies that do need to do all of that reporting, but what if you don't? What if you don't fall in those thresholds? Well, I think companies should expect increasing requirements from their customers to support their own reporting. This will cover things like energy and fuel use, water use, waste and recycling, and materials and product data. You may start hearing the term EPD thrown around a little bit more. This is a way of formalizing the embedded carbon in a product that's being supplied. So start thinking about future possible reporting requirements and get advice if needed. And start now in building a streamlined process to collect those kind of information alongside other financial reporting processes. Often these collection processes can be tied into your standard procurement processes rather than being a whole new thing by a separate team. And I'll pass on to Robert, and he will give you a few more insights about, as a mine operator, what expectations will be coming in terms of Scope 3 for suppliers.
Thanks, Jenny. That's fantastic. There's a lot going on in this space, and just simplifying who needs to report and what they need to do is really helpful. And a great point about, if you're not legally required to report, why you would still want to satisfy your customers' reporting obligations. And just picking up on that point, I'd like to introduce Rob Blyth from Harmony Eva Copper, who'll cover what information they're expecting from suppliers to satisfy Scope 3 reporting requirements. Don't forget, keep putting those questions in the Q&A box as we go. Thanks, Rob.
Thanks, Jenny. Thanks, Marianne. So yeah, I'm going to cover the supplier expectations on Scope 3 reporting in response to the new legislation that's Jenny's just shared with us. So brief agenda, I'll outline what Scope 3 emissions are, give insight as to what the industry expectations are, look at some of the data quality and verification, what sort of data will need to be supplied, touch on some of the support and resources available out there, and then talk to the timelines. So yep, that's the objective for today. So just a refresher, Scope 1 emissions are, as a result directly of burning fuel, fugitive process emissions, and waste decarbonisation. Scope 2 is the indirect greenhouse gas emissions that occur inside the premises of the reporting company, largely electricity. And Scope 3 emissions are, the transportation and activities that occur outside of the actual boundary of the operating entity. So these can represent up to 70% of the emissions for Scope 3. So yeah, why is it important? I guess we're going to need consistent reporting from all, everyone uses suppliers, and we're going to have consistent reporting from various suppliers. So following on from, Jenny's points on the legislation, the NGERS does have some measurement determination legislation in place that describes the method, standards and criteria to be applied when estimating emissions, energy consumption and production numbers. So it's a pretty interesting read. It's pretty prescriptive, and probably the key takeaway here is if you haven't actually gone and looked at it, I'd suggest at least opening the document and understanding what's in it at a high level, because various suppliers will be asking for this information, or depending on the size of your business, you might be asking suppliers to report on some of these things as well. So this is probably the first starting point. Instead of just referring to it and never actually looking at it, actually have a look at it. It's quite interesting. And probably the key point I want to call out here is there's different methods of calculating. So this is quite prescriptive as to what those methods can be. So this slide sort of links back to Jenny's slide, but probably wanted to call out specifically, the FY25, FY26, and the different types of reporting that is going to be requested for suppliers to provide information on. So SLR Consulting identified the most challenging things to address will be reporting on Scope 3 data requests, the scenario analysis with a forward-looking view of potential exposure to climate risk, resilience assessments, how can suppliers respond to their clients' risks identified? How can suppliers support their clients? Are transition plans being put in place? Can suppliers be part of the solution and actually help with the planning and with the change of business strategy? There's an opportunity there for some suppliers to position themselves to actually be part of this and help out with their clients. So probably the key thing is, over the next year or so, companies are going to start receiving these requests. And if they're not prepared, they won't know where to start because it's quite a complex system. So everyone has to get in front of it and start to understand this stuff. So, there's lots of different types of data, but what are some of the key data points or requirements? So, greenhouse gas emission data, energy consumption, waste generation, with some of the scope 3, transport and logistics data, product information, so, carbon footprint, life cycle assessments, emission factors, and waste management practices. That's just the start of the data requirements. So as a supplier supporting your clients, there's some questions you can ask yourself. Can you measure your company's baseline greenhouse gas emission performance? How do you achieve data quality? Is it through having calibrated instruments, raw data, single source of truth of information? Is the data reliable and consistent? Is it being analysed internally? Do you understand the data? Do you have the internal resources to support these data requests? What are the data collection methods? So, expanding on what I just showed you with the Enger's data collection methods. There's, physically recording the data. Is it spreadsheet templates? You're receiving requests from various suppliers or customers. There could be different formats and several requests coming through at the same time that you're going to have to respond to. Depending on the size of the organization, do you have to invest into, automated web-based systems or dedicated software that can support different calculation methodologies for whatever reason? Or do you need a fully integrated system with your ERP systems to, pull diesel consumption, for example, to easily report on that? So there's a few things to consider in respect of capturing the data, analysing it, collating it, and reporting it. That needs to be sort of not a one-size-fits-all approach for businesses. I have just listed some resources there that outlines other calculation tools, lifecycle databases, and various supporting information. ghgprotocol.org and the Enger's determination, which you can Google that to access that document. So this here is a typical data collection survey list of information that requests a description of emission sources and scope. What's the boundary or battery limits and some details, the reporting period, activity data and greenhouse gas emissions and CO2, comparability with previous years' calculation methodologies, emission factors and data sources, which we've already covered, discussion of any uncertainties, trends that are being seen, and progress towards targets. Any significant events that impact the data, and then ratio indicators for allocation. So what does this mean? What's the industry expectations? So, whether it's through tender submissions or other ways, there'll be, requests for roadmaps and transition plans so that, key clients have some visibility as to what the business's roadmap is. Any gap assessments and visibility on gaps that are being addressed. Any risk and opportunity identified and how this positively and negatively impacts goods and services being provided. Assistance with calculations and correct methodologies. I guess, product energy data and emission factors, regular and verified reporting, and then there's probably an education piece, so training and education, through the various interactions that you do have with stakeholders across all levels of the business. You might have your typical engineer that isn't actually part of the reporting or the data request process, but is a significant consumer of the products. So it's about making sure that those stakeholders are aware of what they're using and what the sort of ramifications are. So, making sure that everyone's brought on that journey and has an understanding of the requirements. So just to recap, we've covered off on the various calculation methodologies and sources for that. We've covered off on the reporting requirements coming into effect, largely through Jenny. We've talked about some different data collection, data sources, systems, methods, and tools, and the types of data that be requested in the near term. And then a bit of a self-assessment with, questions that suppliers should ask themselves. How can they position themselves with all of those sort of factors to consider to be ready for these reporting requests? And finally, as we just touched on, the industry expectations with roadmaps, transition plans, training, gap assessments, and the product data. So just a parting question, do you know if your top 5 suppliers have started, or are your bottom 5 suppliers even aware of these requirements? So it's about bringing them on the journey with us. That's all from me. So I'll hand back to Marianne. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Rob. I think we're getting a consistent message there about getting started and really the need to be prepared, because if you are asked for information and you haven't started collecting it, it'll be a bit of a, or not a bit of a, it'll be a big scramble. We've got a few questions in the Q&A box, so keep those questions coming, and just to give you a little bit more time to get those questions in. I just thought I'd highlight a few resources that you might not be aware of that Austmine has to help you on your ESG journey. So the first one is have a look at our Getting Started with ESG webinar. It's a recording we did last year, which is still absolutely timely, and because it's really about practical steps, what you need to do and how you need to do it just to get started with ESG. And the webinar recording is on our website. All of these are on our website, actually. And the next one, this is more around the society side of ESG. You can join and encourage all your staff to register for a free diversity and inclusion course. It's quite a simple course. It's 4 half-hour modules. It's very easy, and it's actually quite entertaining. And it's designed to support teams be more innovative through developing diverse and inclusive teams. And as many of your team as are interested in this can do it. So we've got quite a few. We've got really no limit to the amount of free places that are available at the moment. And if you complete the course, you receive a certificate as well. And lastly, we've talked about getting started with decarbonisation. A few of you mentioned, our speakers mentioned the ENGA. So this is a recorded course. It's sponsored by ABB as part of their Real Progress for a Sustainable Future initiative, which is fantastic. The course covers all the jargon, how to calculate your carbon footprint. We do actually use the ENGA calculator for that, and develop a carbon emissions reduction plan. And it features speakers from BHP and Harmony Gold discussing their decarbonisation requirements of their suppliers. So you're hearing it from the horse's mouth. And it's supported by a toolkit that you'll be able to use for tenders, quotes, pre-qualifications, etc. To encourage, given the changing, the bill that's before Parliament and all the changes with legislation, to encourage people to complete this course and get started on that journey. we're discounting it for $129 to the end of June. You don't have to complete the course by the end of June. It's a 3-module plus homework course, but you will need to actually register to get that discount price by the 30th of June. All of that's on our website. Okay, well, let's get started with some Q&A. We've got quite a few questions there, so let's have a look. So the first question is for you, Angie. How is the scrutiny from investors practically changing practices in mining on the top issue, local community impact? I assume they listen to their investors.
I think there's definitely an element of listening to investors, given that's where the capital comes from. I think one of the things that we've seen is that, obviously, as I mentioned, there is that link with ESG and capital. And there are now a whole range of kind of ratings agencies, if you like, for sustainability metrics as well. And what we've seen is, I guess, now that they're being measured, and we've just heard a lot about the standards and regulations coming into play. And therefore, I think, communities and working with communities is one of those measures. And so we're seeing communities kind of being worked into almost every ESG issue. So if we think about tailings, there's an element of community collaboration. Water stewardship, it's about talking to communities. And we've seen how that can go wrong as well, with the first quantum mine in Panama, which is largely around water, I think. And there's also, closure. I talked about kind of legacy after mine, and what are you going to be leaving your communities once the mine closes. But then there's also investing in communities now. So how do we make more livable communities? How do we not just have fly in, fly out, but have communities that are thriving? And then I guess there's also cultural heritage, which is a big topic, which also involves Indigenous communities. I also mentioned around Indigenous, the fact that so many of the new mines will be on Indigenous land, and how do you work with communities to really negotiate those licenses for mutual benefit of everyone. And then there is also the element of suppliers, ensuring that the suppliers within your community are suppliers to the mine as well. So those are just some of the examples that I could think of off the top of my head.
Thanks, Angie. I have another question here. I think it's for all of you, and I'm not sure if we'll be able to answer this in this forum, but we'll give it a go. So the New South Wales government is investigating associated skills required for industry. I'd be interested in the industry perspective on the applicability and demand for this training. I've just opened the link, and it is a unit of competency called Enable Traceability in Supply Chains. So I think in a general sense, some of you would be able to answer that. Who would like to start?
Not across those particular modules, but I would say I think that there is a demand for micro-credentials in particular. There are people that are doing kind of adjacent jobs that are going to be given responsibility for this kind of reporting and supply chain investigation to verify these things, and the availability of micro-credentials that support them just upskilling to step sideways into these new responsibilities is going to be super important.
Yeah, I might just add to that, I guess, before these data requests go out to suppliers, procurement departments in particular that are an interface, between businesses and suppliers will be hopefully trained in this space, so they understand, why the data is required, how to source the data, and any queries that do come back from suppliers. So procurement in particular will need some training in this space. I probably can't answer the question holistically, but definitely training is required.
Okay, great. Thank you. Hopefully that answered some of your questions around that. Another question we've got here is a few speakers mentioned the circular economy, and wondering if what examples you're seeing in terms of an uptake in circular economy in the mining sector.
I can talk about one of my favourite topics, which is secondary prospectivity. So this is where we're looking to reprocess waste that has already been processed on mine sites, legacy ones or currently operating mines, to supply some of the requirements for critical minerals for the energy transition. It has its own challenges. Not all of them are commercial, but they can also reduce environmental liabilities and the associated bonds. So that's definitely an area of circular economy that's being strongly looked at in the sector. And there are also opportunities to then use potentially some of that reprocessed material in other ways. For instance, separating out certain fractions to be used as a sand.
Great, thanks, Jenny. Rob, anything that you're seeing in terms of, new mine? No. Angie?
I think one of the areas of focus that I've seen is around batteries, around getting minerals back out of batteries. I was at the Critical Mineral Conference AusIMM did last year, and there was a lot of focus on how to actually do that from a logistical perspective. And I think it's really important as well, given the lifespan of batteries and how many will be needed to make sure that that is a circular economy.
I think we're recognizing the need for it. Practical on the ground examples are a little light on, but there are examples. The one that I think of is there's a lot of tires that are pushed into mine pits all across the country. And it does need government and kind of regional collaboration and coordination to make these things happen. There's a great example in California of tire collection and recycling, but that's something I'd love to see here.
Great, thank you. Next question. Decarbonisation will increase the cost of my goods and services and could price me out of the market. Do you agree with that? Is that valid? Anyone want to take that one on?
What I've seen with innovation applied to business is it often generates new revenue streams and more efficient ways of doing business. So, people default into this new thing's going to cost me more, but if you actually investigate it properly, you can find creative ways of doing things that ultimately can actually decrease the cost. So you can decarbonize and save money at the same time.
Yeah, some decarbonisation options around reducing the energy or fuel used in your process. Whilst they might take a little bit of time and cost to investigate and implement, they actually do save you in operating costs because you're not forking out for all of that power and fuel that you were previously using. And because this is now kind of mandatory reporting requirements coming in, that means that it's not really competitive, like everyone's going to have to do it. So it's not really a disadvantage either. And if you do it well, it creates an opportunity because you may have produced a product that reduces the Scope 3 emissions of your client.
Do you want to add to that, Angie?
I was going to say much the same around energy efficiency over the longer term.
Yeah, and that product development is really important too. In some of the slides, even with the reporting, there was, you mentioned that you have to report on the technologies that you're using and what your map is as far as those technologies. So I guess there's opportunities there as well for companies to help their customers. Okay, we've got one more question. Another thing, sorry, you mentioned, I'm not sure who this question's for, you mentioned a crackdown of greenwashing. Just wondering if someone can expand on that, and what does this mean? And what are the examples? What greenwashing were you talking about?
Sure. So greenwashing is a term that refers to making statements about how net zero or green or low impact emissions your product is without having that backed up with real data. So yeah, that's those that are doing that publicly are starting to have a little bit of a crackdown from ASIC where that's of a large impact to their customer base. So it's something to look out for, that if you're going to say something publicly, that you actually have data to back it up.
I think there's also some environmental organizations that are starting to litigate against companies for greenwashing, particularly kind of around if you've made a net zero, a commitment around net zero that doesn't include scope 3, for example, I think was one of the examples recently.
That's interesting, isn't it? That one particularly. Okay, I don't think we don't have any more questions in the Q&A box. Anyone got any of our speakers got any final comments, anything that you like to add? No? Okay. Well, it's been fantastic to have you here today. Thank you, Angie, Jenny and Rob, for your valuable insights. The ESG landscape is evolving all the time, and it's great that we can have experts come and fill us in on what's going on. So thank you, and thank you everyone for joining in, and I hope to catch up with you soon at an Austmine event. Bye everyone.